So our next presenter is J. A. Edward Chamberlin, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of Toronto. He has written extensively on the oral and written traditions of indigenous peoples, from the Aboriginal peoples of North America to the hunters of the Kalahari and the herders of Mongolia. He worked on the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline Inquiry and the Alaska Native Claims Commission, was Senior Research Associate with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and has worked extensively on native land claims in Canada, the United States, Africa, and Australia. He served as poetry editor of Saturday Night Magazine and has lectured widely on literary, historical, and cultural issues. His books include The Harrowing of Eden, White Attitudes Toward Native Americans, Oscar Wilde's London, Come Back to Me, My Language, Poetry in the West Indies, If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories, Finding Common Ground, Horse, How the Horse Has Shaped Civilization, and an edited volume with Daniel F. Chamberlain, or Words to That Effect, Orality and the Writing of Literary History. In addition, he recently published a memoir, The Banker and the Blackfoot, a memoir of my grandfather, Reaching New Country. His presentation is titled Chanting Down Babylon. Please help me welcome.
Thank you very much. My thanks to Janan, Peter, and their colleagues at the Center for Poetry and Poetics for the invitation to the symposium and the opportunity to be with such distinguished colleagues and those of you who come today. It's a privilege to be in your company. I'll begin with a poem that brings poetry and race together, and does so by raising the question of whether it's possible to do so. By the waters of Babylon we sat down and wept when we remembered thee, O Zion. As for our harps, we hanged them up upon the trees that are therein. For they that led us away captive required of us a song and melody in our heaviness. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And this is a song that offers an answer. Come, we go burn down Babylon one more time. Come, we go chant down Babylon one more time. For them soft, yes, them soft. And how I know, and that's how I know. With music, make me chant down Babylon. Bob Marley's song, Chant Down Babylon, takes up the burden of Psalm 137 and transforms it into a celebration of the power of song. Music is the key, he chants, and not just any music, but jazz music, fusing poetry and race and guru drumming with Count Ozzy and the mystic revelation of Rastafari, in the rhythms and melodies of mento and ska, in rock steady, to which the melodians sang The Rivers of Babylon, which has become an anthem for many Rastafarians, and for Marley in reggae. Citing up the presence of slavery and the continuing exile of his people, his race, from Africa, but dismissing the violence called for in the concluding lines of the song, O daughter of Babylon, happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. Marley prophesies that since Babylon is soft, with the corruptions of material comfort, chanting will destroy it, fulfilling the book, as he sings in his redemption song. And how do I know all this, he asks? That's how, he answers, doing it. The 19th century musician Robert Schumann answered a question about the meaning of a composition by playing it again. William Blake responded to a question in his poem, The Tiger, about the fearful symmetry of creation by piling on more questions. Marley turns to the rituals of riddle and charm, the sponsor of song, to chant down Babylon and to bring himself and his people home. But where is home? In what language do we seek answers? And in what form? Before we take up these questions, let's listen to a few stanzas from a poem written after the Detroit Uprising of 1967, when burning down Babylon seemed to many people the only thing on offer. Sometimes called the 12th Street Riots, it was precipitated by a police raid on a speakeasy, an unlicensed after-hours bar. Out of burlap sacks, out of bearing butter, out of black bean and wet slate bread, Out of the acids of rage, the candor of tar, out of creosote, gasoline, drive shafts, wooden dollies, they lie and grow. Earth is eating trees, fence posts, gutted cars. Earth is calling in her little ones, come home, come home. From pig balls, from the ferocity of pig driven to holiness, from the furred ear and the full jowl, come the repose of the hung belly. From the purpose, they lie and grow. The poet is Philip Levine, who early in his life was employed by General Motors near Detroit, where he and an African-American co-worker had responsibility for sorting used gear and axle parts, spreading them out and looking at them carefully, he recalled, because we were the guys who do the job of rebuilding them. We had 2 sacks that we were putting them in, burlap sacks, and at one point my companion held up a sack and on it were the words, Detroit Municipal Zoo. And he laughed and said, they feed, they lion, they meal in they sacks. And I thought, the guy's a genius with language. He knew that he was speaking in English that I didn't speak, but that I would understand. Almost parodying it, even though he appreciated the loveliness of it. Writing between shifts on a concrete grease shop floor, Levine's inspiration at the time was Keats. Unquestionably his life, John Keats, unquestionably his life had been far harder than mine, he later reflected. And yet he had made immortal poetry out of it. Of course, he had the advantage of being a genius. And another advantage too. He'd inherited a tradition that by age 23 he knew intimately, one that showed him how to achieve beauty. He also knew something I wouldn't learn for years, that beauty mattered, that it could transform our experience into something worthy, that like love, it could redeem our lives. I wanted fire and I wanted gunfire. I wanted to burn down Chevrolet gear and axle and waste the government of the United States. But despite his admiration for Keats, it was another poet who saved Levine's soul during these years and taught him how to chant down rather than burn down Babylon, taught him what the Lord's song in a strange land might sound like. A poet he describes while standing in the stacks of the Wayne State University Library. I read my life in his words, he recalls. I denounce everyone who ignores the other half, the half that can't be redeemed, who lift their mountains of cement, and where all of us will fall in the last feast of pneumatic drills. A wooden wind from the south, slanting through the black mire, spits on the broken boats and drives tacks into shoulders. A south wind that carries tusks, sunflowers, alphabets, and a battery with drowned wasps. This was a song of a young Andalusian poet named Garcia Lorca, known to Levine at the time only as a writer of beautiful, exotic gypsy lyrics. Lorca was writing of his first visit to New York when he cried, I don't understand, I don't understand. Later taken by a friend in October 1929 to view Wall Street at midnight and watching the cobra hiss on the uppermost levels as the market crashed in a pyramid of moss, he cried, I do understand. Lorca's poem gave Levine both the courage and something of the craft to write, as he puts it, a poetry of violence held in abeyance and enclosed in a musical form. From the sweet glues of the trotters come the sweet kinks of the fist, from the full flower of the hams, the thorax of caves. From bow down, come rise up. Come they lion from the reeds of shovels, the grained arm that pulls the hands, they lie and grow. From my 5 arms and all my hands, from all my white sins forgiven they feed. From my car passing under the stars, they lion. From my children inherit, from the oak turned to a wall, they lion. From they sack and they belly open, and all that was hidden burned on the open oil-stained earth. They feed, they lion, and he comes. Levine's poem has roots in many traditions. He himself mentions Christopher Smart's Jubilate Agno, and like many chants, at first it is not easy to understand. Its rhythms rendering it both almost incomprehensible and clear as a bell. And that contradiction is central to its power, as it is to the power of poetry. I don't understand. I do understand. And then again, I don't understand, which is why we return again and again to the poems we admire. I believe that we need to become as comfortable with this litany. I don't understand. I do understand. I don't understand, with respect to race, as we are to poetry, or as liberatingly uncomfortable. The critic John Crowe Ransom once identified a literary text as one that reveals the kind of knowledge by which we must know what we have arranged that we shall not know otherwise. It's a useful definition, bringing us right back to the mystery of poetry that has fascinated readers and listeners from time immemorial. Since Ransom is often credited with the phrase new criticism from the title of a book he published in 1941, calling him up as a new critic these days is like telling a dirty joke in polite company. But he did call for a turn to the traditions within which poetry makes meaning and offers knowledge. And he was, though he never acknowledged it, following in the footsteps of another literary critic named Joel Spingarn 30 years earlier, who had announced an earlier new criticism, a much more convincing one, in a lecture with that title that was published by Columbia University Press in 1911. At the time, Spingarn was chair of comparative literature at Columbia and a contentious troublemaker, proposing a criticism that would replace what he characterized as the grab bag of sociology, psychology, dogmatic historicism, reactionary idealism, and decadent impressionism that passed for literary criticism in his day. He brought this conviction not only to his essays on Dante and Milton, but also to his celebration of African American writers during the Harlem Renaissance, acknowledging their struggles in the same way he did those of the artists during troubled times in Europe. He was acutely aware of the particular social and economic and political conditions of the black artists he admired. And when he was fired by Columbia for supporting a disgraced colleague, he co-founded the publishing house of Harcourt Brace and Company, publishing African-American writers including Claude McKay and W.B. Du Bois from its very beginning. He also helped establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, the NAACP. He was its second president, and he was the chairman of its board for 27 years, until his death in 1939. He's still remembered for the Spingarn Medal and for his unlikely friendship with the notoriously fractious W.E.B. Du Bois. The novelist and anthropologist and celebrant of folk songs, as we heard this morning, Zora Neale Hurston, once wrote that Du Bois, the bitterest opponent of the white race that America has ever known, loved Joel Spingarn and was certainly loved by him. The thing doesn't make sense, it just makes beauty. Spingarn's literary criticism, in fact, is interesting because it picks up someone I was reminded of this morning during Nathan's talk, Michael Chapman in South Africa, who always talked about literary criticism, always talks about literary critics as interventionists in political dynamics of the time. Say a few things about him in the discussion perhaps. Another nice surprise around this time. In 1909, a couple of years before Spingarn published his new criticism essay, there was a memorable presentation in New York at the recently established Modern Languages Association conference. The musicologist and folklorist John Lomax presented a paper on cowboy songs and sang some of the ones that were to appear in his landmark book, Cowboy Songs and Other Frontier Ballads. One of them was Riding Old Paint, I'm Leaving Cheyenne. You wonder, where the hell am I going with this? Which by the time I was growing up was the last song played at dances in ranch country at West. And one of Lomax's revelations, still startling to many people over a century later, was that it was written not by some 19th century Roy Rogers or John Wayne, but by an African American named Charlie Willis, working in the cattle trails north from Texas. Lomax had just finished graduate study at Harvard under the supervision of George Kittredge, successor as professor of English to the distinguished scholar Francis James Child, editor of the famous collection English and Scottish Popular Ballads, often referred to as the Child Ballads. So folk songs were at the heart of the humanities back then, when literary studies was finding its way alongside classical studies in the academy. And such songs as Riding Old Paint offer new and still offer new insight into the convergence of poetry and race, among other things, greatly expanding our sense of what constitutes their form and their function. And there's much to be learned on this score, for it's now estimated that African Americans made up a quarter, that's right, 25% of the cowboys on the frontier in the last decades of the 19th century, chanting down the restless cattle on those long and given the constant risk of stampedes when the weather turned dangerous cattle drivers. The picture, the myth of the Western Plains and indeed of the frontier settlement of the Americas needs adjusting. And those songs may finally make it happen, which will help make other things happen, chanting down another Babylon. 25 years later, Lomax brought another tradition of poetry and race together when he brought Leadbelly to perform his songs at what was advertised as a smoker come sing-along at the annual conference of the MLA in Philadelphia. Lost. The Babylon that I've been talking about is not just the center of comfortable commerce described in the book of Revelations, but a place separated from everything that gives mental and spiritual as well as physical nourishment. And it constitutes not just a form of captivity and exile, but a coruscating uncertainty of what it is we're exiled from, with the question, where is home, hovering like a duppy? We live in a place that is not our own, and much more, not ourselves. And hard it is, in spite of blazing days, writes Wallace Stevens in his poem Notes Towards a Supreme Fiction. That's the bad news. The good news is, in the words of Stevens, it follows, from this the poem springs. From this the poem springs, and poetry and race come into their own. But what if we don't understand what we mean by either poetry or race? That uncertainty, as I've been suggesting, indeed in some ways uncertainty has been a theme today, that uncertainty may be where we need to start and where literary criticism needs to help us navigate. When I began sailing on the west coast of Canada, the best nautical charts of the Pacific were filled with so-called islands marked PD and ED. The first meant position doubtful, and the second, existence doubtful. This was the 1960s, and I should emphasize, not the 1690s. And it wasn't encouraging, but it did keep us watching and wondering. And it ensured that we navigated on the assumption that we were always almost lost, literally and figuratively at sea. I got to like it. I worry that in our colleges and universities we're trying to obliterate that feeling. But that's for another day. Leaving poetry to fend for itself and in the best of hands today, whatever we mean by race, uncertainty is often its handmaid, and the idea of home is often at its heart. Not just the pseudo-scientific idea of race that has had such a hold on so many people for so long, but the no less controversial idea that prevailed in the 19th century, and continues, of course, through today, prevailed in the 19th century with the great literary critic Hippolyte Taine, writing his magisterial history of English literature to define the features of race to distinguish that literature, the racial characteristics that shaped what he called its literary monuments as well as its temporary documents, the stories and songs and the languages that reflected particular, which he said, racial as well as cultural thoughts and feelings and behaviors, and that constituted the idea of home. There are few places as unsettled as home. It may be where we hang our hat or where our heart is, which may be the same place or maybe not. It may be where we choose to live or where we are chosen by birth or the blessings of the Creator. Home may be here below or up above, real or imagined, in our past or in our future. And it may be nowhere at all, an ideal place like utopia, a Greek word, which of course means no place. But whatever and wherever it is, it holds us close. In 1973, about to leave his native Ulster for exile in the Republic of Ireland, Seamus Heaney published a poem, in his book Wintering Out, that addressed the Civil War called The Troubles that had broken out in his native Ulster a few years earlier. Called The Tolland Man, the poem described the body of a man named after the place where he was discovered in a remarkably preserved state in the peat bogs of Denmark, a victim of ritual murders carried out by northern peoples 1,500 years earlier. And in his final lines, Heaney made a connection with the sectarian violence in his homeland. Out there in Jutland, in the old man-killing parishes, I will feel lost, unhappy, and at home. Heaney puts no punctuation between unhappy and at home. And he followed this up with poems in his book North, made these connections both racial and religious, and very uncomfortable. A couple of years later, Michael Hart, a poem from the Irish Republic, made a different move, describing a scene in a local pub. Her eyes were coins of porter, and her West Limerick voice talked velvet in the house. Her hair was black as a glossy fireplace, wearing with grace her Sunday night dance best. She cut the froth from glasses with a knife and hammered golden whiskies on the bar, and her mountainy body tripped the gentle mechanism of verse. The minute interlock of word and word began, the rhythm formed. I sunk my hands into tradition, sifting the centuries for words. The cliches came at first, like matchsticks snapping from the world of work. Monda, shave, defoltach, alan, coin. They came like gray slabs of slate breaking from an ancient quarry, slowly vaulting down the dark, unused escarpments, crashing on the cogs. Splinters like axe heads damaged the wheels, clogging the intricate machine. Maimla, shave, defoltach, alan, coin. Then Pegasus pulled up, the girth broke, and I was flung back on the gravel of Anglo-Saxon. Defoltach means roughly black-haired. Alan translates as beautiful. Mamla, shave, and coin are words whose meanings are close to the English adjectives graceful and gentle. For Hartnett, these Irish words are a final sign that we are human and Irish and at home. They're also a reminder that Gaelic is the conscience of our leaders, the memory of a mother rape they will not face, the heap of bloody rags they see and scream at in their boardrooms of mock oak. And in this poem, Hartnett is saying a farewell to English, choosing to write henceforth in the Irish language. I will not see great men go down who walked in rags from town to town, finding English a necessary sin, the perfect language to sell pigs in. I have made a choice and leave with little weeping. I have come with meager voice to court the language of my people. Hartnett's English leave-taking becomes his Celtic homecoming. I like to quote from an extraordinary range of poems written by my wife, Lorna Goodison. Annie Pengley comes to mind right away, but then a blessed rain shower of others, but of courtesy and tact and common sense. I'll leave that to her. Instead, I'll conclude with a poem by the late Jamaican, her late Jamaican friend Dennis Scott, a poem that transcends the distinctions we often make between literary and local language, as Lorna does every day, while intensifying, again as Lorna does, a Jamaican legacy of race that has grim universal resonance. Scott's poem is entitled Epitaph, and it takes up the burden of Jahan's inspiring writings about elegy. They hang them on a clement morning, swung between the falling sunlight and the woman's breathing, like a black apostrophe to pain. All morning while the children hushed their hopscotch joy and the cane kept growing, he hung there sweet and low. At least that's how they tell it. It was long ago, and what can we recall of a dead slave or two, except that when we punctuate our island tale, they swing like sighs across the brutal sentences, and anger pauses till they pass away. The heritage is here in a catalog, and indeed in its elegiac way, a celebration of West Indian experience. The legacy of sugar, bitter rather than sweet, for those enslaved to work the plantations that for so long provided the main economic resource for the West Indies. The juxtaposition of brutality and beauty, they hanged him on a clement morning, and the ironies of a familiar sentimentality, sweet and low. The wonder of human beings in the presence of something immeasurably larger than themselves, whether the awful power of the slave system or the hushed loveliness of life, renewed every morning and sustained by the gaiety of children. The mix of spoken and written languages, punctuated by silence and suffering, and the stark image of the hanged man, a black apostrophe to pain. The experience of West Indian women, whose place has often been obscured, but who both literally and figuratively have given breath to their people, and whose bravery has deep roots in this heritage. And the uncertainties of all such accounts, at least that's how they tell it, underwritten as they are by a mix of beauty and fear, as well as rage and resignation, which is to say, using an old-fashioned word of wonder that Rastafari brought back to us by dread, and signifying a humanity that paradoxically defies both hanging and history. Those aren't the only things that poetry and race have in common, but they'll do for now.